Okay, before the break, we started looking at PowerShell, just some little things in terminal, and there are some, using that will be very, very useful no matter where you're heading in IT. Our most basic task, right? We navigate to a folder, so you can use the old command for that. Most people do, instead of the new PowerShell one. So like CD, // So dot refers to the current folder that you're in. So remember we talked about parent-child relationships. So dot is the parent of the current folder. So if you need to go up a pathway, you can say // to go up. Set location is the new way, but most people go with the old way for that. If you have things are space delimited means separated. So if you have spaces in your folder name, make sure you put quotation marks around it. Tell the computer, quote me on there is a space in this word, in this name. Change directory into that delete directory, and you can navigate all around your computer and then make new items. So mkdir, just like CD was the make directory in all the old ones. For PowerShell, when they updated it, it's an item. We saw a remove item. Actually, I think I just looked up the reference material for remove item. We didn't actually do anything with it. But the keyword is going to be new item. We need a new item, and has a couple parameters that are needed. Absolutely required is a name. We have to give it a name. So new item, I'll call this testing 1, 2, 3, and hit enter. If we only give it a name, notice it gave us a file. So the default is a file. We can do better than that. Oh, now I'll do that remove item. So like remove dash item testing 1, 2, 3. And now if I list out what's in here, I'll just use the Linux command, get back to that. Mix and match them. For your general work, the commands that are like 2 or 3 letters long, you're definitely going to commit to memory are nice. But when we get to more complicated things, much more complex than we'll see in tonight's example, then the nice new naming convention really takes off, really stands out. For changing directory and listing the things out there, the old commands are fine for those if you know those. So remove that. Clear. When we do a new item, we have to give it a file path. We don't have to put the parameter name if we give them in a specific order. And obviously the path is going to be first every time, so we could leave that off, but we just do the name. But it's often better to include it because typing's not hard. Don't be lazy with typing. It's worth it to avoid mistakes. So the new path, and I'll make a folder called testing, and then we have another parameter we can put in here for item type. Let me write that in Pascal. So item type, it's 2 words. We can't have spaces in our keywords, so just jam those 2 words together, and typically that would be written with capital letters somewhere to tell where the second word starts. And item type it's either a file or a directory. I'll say directory. And hit enter, and this time, notice it gave us, we're going to probably see something different on Linux, but it gave us a directory, and then we can navigate into that directory, testing, and make a new item with a path of stuff.txt. Let's give it a name, and this time I'll set the item type to a file. And then we can do other stuff. We can put stuff in that file. So like a value parameter of here are some words for the file. And then the quotation mark. So notice I've wrapped them entirely in quotation marks, indicate the very specific string there. And put that in there. We can see the length of it is 33 bytes. So it's there. I can go open that up in the directory. Open it in a normal text editor, I guess. Maybe, oh, there it is. When we see it created that file, put the words in it. Obviously, we can read the words the same way. So some important ones, get content. And the path we want to get content from is that one we just created. So we're in the right directory. So just get content from stuff.txt. Or it could add content to it. Add content at stuff.txt and the value more words. Now if I hit the up button and run that get content again, you see it added more words on at the end. Usually file writing shows up much later when we're talking about software development, but since we're doing it in a terminal, I figured I'd do that first. Technically, we'd call it persistent data. Our data lasts for more than one run of our program. We have to store it somewhere because our software, everything except databases, software runs in RAM, and RAM's temporary volatile storage. It's only going to last until we shut the machine down at the absolute longest. And hopefully not even that long, because something else might need the RAM before we get around to shutting down the machine. So it's not going to be there long. So if we want to keep things, we have to put them in a file somewhere. It's also set content. And do you see the naming conventions we have in Powershell here? Content is the thing we want to change about that file, or the thing we want to access, and we can get it, we can set it, we can add it. Lots of things that we can do. Set content, the value of new words. And when I retrieve that again, you'll see that it replaced the old contents of that file with a completely new contents. So we can write a file, something that'll be useful, navigate between directories. Oops. But we're talking about this in terms of software. We usually think of more than one instruction at a time, which that making folders and files is an assignment this week. If you're not used to using terminals, I would recommend doing it in a terminal. If you are used to using terminals, I would ask that you do it try to learn a new way to do it. Keyboard shortcuts are great. You write a Python script that does it. There's lots and lots of different ways to do it. If you're used to terminals, you can push, like on a Windows machine, push Windows E to open your Explorer and do it all with the keyboard controls. So without using the mouse, I can go up to the documents/delete. I can go over to my delete folder and, whoops, not that. Hit Control-Shift-N, make a new folder. That's GUI, and go into that folder and maybe go up to here and open my Sublime text editor with a file called newfile.txt, and do it entirely with keyboard shortcuts and never touching your mouse. So with that assignment, it's another one of those foundational skills. There's the things we want to be able to take for granted on your way through school. If your instructor creates an assignment and says, make 3 folders to do this, we want to make absolutely certain that we can take that for granted and everybody knows how to create a folder, which I'm pretty sure everybody knows how to do, but I left that one in there to try and learn a new one. Open Task Scheduler or Chrome and schedule that to happen. So if you're planning on waking up at 8:30 tomorrow morning, go ahead and schedule your computer to create a couple folders and files inside of them at 8:45, and then when you wake up in the morning, turn on your computer and take a screenshot of the folders it created that you scheduled the task for. Challenge yourself, right? That's how we improve. That's how we get better. So whatever you learn, try something new. I highly, highly recommend terminals if you're not familiar with that, because that's one that will pay off no matter where you're heading in IT. And if you're in this room, you're probably at least thinking about IT somewhere, right? We usually think about more than just writing those files, navigating between directories. Software, we want to do stuff, like do the math, are for constructs, the problem-solving tools. So just quickly looking at the syntax for them. Sequence is easy. Sequence is just the order that we write them in. The instruction, we can do this as a text file and save it. .ps1 is the extension for PowerShell. If you're on a Linux machine, just put pwsh in your shebang. Just make sure you point at the right interpreter or Python or whichever interpreter you want to use. And then you don't even have to open PowerShell if it's installed. You can run it from your bash shell still, as long as the shebang points at the right thing. Some people are probably very confused by the words I just said, but other people, I think, know what I'm talking about. When you give Linux a try, you'll know what that refers to.
I mean, I just assumed you meant shebang as in like just do it.
Oh, no, shebang. The first line of your file. Oh, let's do that. Might as well clarify that. I'm going to jump over to Linux. So if we wanted to do some stuff, I'll do it in Python instead of bash. We normally do it in a bash script, but I think I have Python on here. Well, Ubuntu has to have Python. Part of the operating system kernel was written with Python 2. So if you're working with Ubuntu, Apple is the same way. Make sure you type Python 3 because part of the operating system kernel was written with Python 2.7, and that is decades out of date now. But it has to be installed on the machine automatically. So you want to use a more modern version. So I say Python 3 and maybe create a file. So I'll create a file. I'll open Vim and create a file called greet.py, little py script. And I'm just going to print the words hello world. So a very brief Python instruction. Right, and leave out of there. Then to run that, what I would normally do is ask for the Python 3 interpreter and then say run greet.py. So if you're a software developer, at the very least, you have to also make a script to go with your software that does this. That way your user doesn't have to open the terminal and say how to run the software and all that. So that'll run. But I know that's going to run on a Linux machine. So a shebang is the first line that goes in there. So if I go back to my text editor, greet.py, I'll go back in insert mode and I'll bring that Python code down a little bit. And the very first line, when we're writing programs and text files, it's useful to have extra things that aren't necessarily the instructions. So we also have this alternative comments code that's the interpreter will ignore. When we go to run this code, some of the text might want to be ignored. Useful things like little messages to say what it's going to do. So like we start with a pound sign, say this function greets the world or something, then give a description of what the software does. So it's turned off, it's a comment. So one way to think of that is like quiet, right? Shh. The typical gesture for quiet. So there's a very special one. So if we do a comment and then follow that up with an exclamation mark, we refer to that as shebang. So like shh, like be quiet from the comment part, and then bang, like the exclamation mark. And we use that line. It has to be the very first line, and we tell it what software to use to run this script. So I can say /bin/Python 3, I think. I might have to go look it up if that's wrong. I think it's, whoops. I'm in an old text editor. Right, and then put it on this. So that first line says, run this with the Python interpreter. And then I don't need that first instruction to run it with the Python interpreter. I can just come down here and say greet.py. Well, I have to make a change. Change mode 755 will probably work. I had the wrong permission. I have to give it permission to run. You'll see there's R's all over the place next to that greet.py. So I had permission to read it, but I didn't have permission to do anything with it. I need the execute permission. So let me try that again. So now if I say ./greet.py, just refer, so dot is the current directory. So in the current directory, look for a file called greet.py. And while we're running that, the software runs without telling it which piece of software is needed to run the software. That's called a shebang. I started mentioning it, I thought I would point that out, and it's just the very first line of the file. So PowerShell scripts, you would just put your shebang to PWSH, or Python interpreter, wherever you want to run the software. We would think about that. I think for now I'll do it here and then point at a very, very useful tool to use to keep this around. So the order, usually we put them in a text file, kind of like I jumped over there and did with Python real quick. We put that in a text file and save them, and then that order handles our sequential tool. For selection tool, we need to make choices. So our keyword for that is going to be if. So we'll write if, and then inside of parentheses, we need to put some sort of condition. So first off, I'm going to set some values. I'll go like x equals 3 and y is assigned the value 4. That way we have things to compare. So we say if x is less than 3 or equal or greater, our math conditions. However, in most languages, we would use the greater than or less than symbol like we know from math class. But if you look at my screen, you'll notice just a few characters earlier in PowerShell, the greater than symbol is already used for something very important. So we can't reuse that here. So there's another common abbreviation when we want to avoid reusing symbols in too many ways. That's called overloading our operators. We don't want to put too many, we don't want to do too many things with the same symbol because that's going to get confusing after a while. So we do a little 2-letter abbreviation, like -LP for less than, -EQ if they're equal, -GT if they're greater than. So I'll say less than, that would be true in this case. So if the value stored in X is less than the value stored in Y, and then we want a bunch of things to happen if it is. So to combine those things, we use a curly brace. So an opening curly brace, and then we'll type all of the instructions that we want to happen. Okay, sorry, I zoomed and it did something strange for a second. Let me zoom in. I zoomed in the middle of something and it tried to do something strange. So let me zoom in first and then do that. So we open a curly brace and now we'll do all the stuff that we want to do. So like write to our host the sentence, whatever stored in X is smaller than whatever stored in Y. And then I'll make another variable. Triple is going to be 3 times X, whatever stored in that value X. And then write to the host 3 times as much as the value in X is whatever value we stored in triple. And then close the curly brace when we're ready to finish that block. So the curly braces block off a set of instructions based on whether or not that condition is true. So we can see both of them ran in that case. We can go up and edit that. I'm going to edit it real quick. So there's still 3 and a 4 in there. When I go to edit it, the first thing I do is delete that closing curly brace so that it don't accidentally run it, because it's not going to run from here until that curly brace is in there. I'm going to change that to greater. So -EQ would be equal, dash GT for greater. Then we can close that curly brace and we can write a couple more words. We can say else if and do another condition. For those who have seen software before, I'm just going to do one. I'm going to do else. And then the curly brace, and then we can write some instructions that if X is not greater than Y. So if the condition is true, in this case, 3 greater than 4, that would be false. So it's going to skip over that whole first block that's in the curly braces and go to the second block because our condition that we were checking is false. That's how we make selections with software. Then we can write some sentence. Wow, I didn't expect Y to be the bigger value. Something like that in the curly brace, and then we run it, it gets the result from that. So that's how we make choices. For those who have worked with a modern programming language, that should look very, very similar. Print is an old command that you could bring in. That would make it look even more similar to some of the other ones. Or echo. I tend to use echo most often. That was the word I originally used. Echo meant send echo back to the screen. Send something back to the screen. So I tend to use that one a lot. So that's selection structure. So keyword if, and then in parentheses, we set up some condition we can check. And if we need the full binary choice, then we do curly braces, block out a set of instructions we want to run if that condition is true, the keyword else, and then block out a set of instructions we want to run if that is false. Software development's a lot like that. We're just looking at it in the PowerShell syntax tonight. Slightly different syntax, but similar logic. And that was the update, because if you go back to those old terminals, it's different. And they are all different and inconsistent and they don't seem to align with our modern programming languages very well. That's one of the nice things about PowerShell is it's a modern scripting language. Reiteration and repetition, we need to repeat stuff. That's very similar. There's several ways. I'm just going to show one. So just like in if else, making a choice, we can say while, and then give it some condition that we want to check. And as long as that condition is true, it's going to keep doing it. So one thing that we do need to watch out for is to make sure that that condition does change. So I'll set a value. I'll set $I. That's just a convention to start with. I'll start it at the value 0. So I is assigned the value 0. And while, and then in parentheses, I'll say I is less than maybe 10. I'm going to write to the host, counting up. Currently at I. And then anytime you're in a programming language that has a $, we don't have to do anything special to get that in a sentence. If there's a $, just throw it right into your sentence. There is a special thing that $, means something to the language. So if we have to do something special, if we actually want to type a $. But if it allows us to put our variables directly into a sentence. So counting up, we're currently at some number, and then we better make sure I changes somewhere along the way. Otherwise, we will we'd get stuck just doing the same instruction over and over again. So what we normally do is say I is going to be reassigned the value, whatever was in I plus 1 more. And this is a very common instruction I want to pause on for a second. If we look at this, this tells us with certainty that the computer does not run the instructions in the same order we write them in. Because I is whatever stored in I plus another number. That would be an infinite loop on its own. So that tells us with certainty that the computer runs our instructions right to left, not left to right in the order we write them in. Or we type them in. Too many rights in that sentence. The computer runs them right to left. The stuff on the right-hand side of the equals sign runs before the stuff on the left side. This line proves that works. This is a very common thing. We're going to take a value and change it by an amount. So common that there's an abbreviation for that. In pretty much every single programming language. And we typically call it an assignment operator, or oftentimes a reassignment operator, because we cannot start with that. But an equivalent thing would say I plus equals 1. That's exactly the same as that line was just wrote. I equals I plus 1. It's just abbreviated. But plus and minus 1 are going to be even more common than any other number when we do that, right? Sometimes we might go by even numbers, do plus minus 2, might count by tens, by hundreds, but counting by ones, we're going to do a lot. So it even gets a special abbreviation. So I plus plus just increments or decrements by 1. Just a special syntax since it happens so often. For clarity, I'm just going to go back to the first one. I equals whatever was stored in I plus 1. And some people just like to write it out the full way the whole time because they think it's a little bit clearer to see when you go back and look at code that you wrote 5 years ago. Makes it a little clearer to see. So there's a lot of personal preference, different ways to do it, but that'll be enough instructions. We print something out. We are changing the value so that our condition will eventually be true. We'll start at 0. We're eventually going to hit true. So we can close off that block and run that. And then there's how we get our reiteration structure. You can see that there's some slight variance. We do the same thing. We write those words out to the screen, except that the number is at a different value every time. If we wanted to include 10 here, we could do -LE for less or equal. Hopefully all of those prefixes are obvious. Is that from what we've seen, LT is less than, EQ is equal, LE is less or equal, GT is greater. Hopefully all of them are predictable from there. They follow a very nice naming convention. That's one of the things about the modern languages. So that's all of this. Only thing left is jump out of our sequence, do some other stuff, and come back to it. And to do that, we use what's called functions. So we'll write a keyword function. I'm going to call it do stuff. I'm going to put a couple of parameters here. I'll put an X and a Y, and then open curly braces like before. And maybe I'll do those last couple things. So if X is less than Y, I'll write out to the host, X is the, I'll actually write X. X is the smaller number. The first number was smaller. You'll see why I went with the first number here in a moment. We can close that if block and say otherwise, write to the host, the first number is bigger. Those look the same. I'll do it Yoda style. Bigger, the first number is. That way it's very clear which one's which. So I'll close that curly brace, but if we count backwards, close one curly brace, that closed out this one. And this one closes this one, so we still have one curly brace open, so we can do more stuff here. And come down to the next line and say, while X is less than Y, and open curly brace, right to the host, getting closer, and then say X equals $X plus 1. So in this case, when I pass numbers in, I need to be very, very careful to make sure that X is the smaller number. I guess it just wouldn't happen at all. Is it if we pass in 20 for X and 5 for Y, that condition's already false, so we'd never start repeating. Close that curly brace and close that other curly brace. And that's what a function looks like. So we have this function called do stuff. And then we set up some parameters. We saw that word earlier. That was a very important thing in what we type in terminals, are space delimited parameters. They go in parentheses here and then curly braces to block out all of the instructions we want to run. We ask for that. And then to ask for it, well, I just pass in that name. So I just created a new PowerShell command. That's what our functions are. It's repeatable, but we can jump out of whatever sequence we're in, ask for this to happen. So maybe X is 1 and Y is 5. And notice how I pass those in. That's a little bit different than the languages you're used to because we are in a terminal. We have to space delimit things. Parentheses means something else when we type them directly in a terminal. So space delimit the arguments being sent to fill the parameters, some keywords there. This class is a lot about vocabulary, but I'll pass it in with that. So it tells us the first number was smaller, then keeps doing that repeated loop until it's not the smaller number. But then we can ask for it over and over again. Do stuff with 7 and 21. Again, the first number is smaller, and then it just keeps repeating that task that we ask it to until those numbers are the same. Do stuff. And that's where all of the terminal commands came from. Somebody created a function. So when you're out there working in IT, that's something just about every single one of us is going to do at some point. That's why I want to show terminals. You're going to write functions to make your job easier in the terminal. It's going to be something you do in the terminal over and over and over again. So you're probably going to want to consolidate all that stuff that you do repeatedly to a single word instead of a dozen different words. Instead of a dozen different keywords built into the terminal, consolidate it to a single word so you can ask for them all at once, basically. Do stuff with, if we do it the other way, 21 and 7. So we get it does the other thing. The first number is bigger, so it never even starts our loop. But that's how we do invocation. We jump out of our sequence, do something else, and come back to it. We just went through our whole list, right? That's what software development is. And the software development program is lots and lots of practice at that and problem solving. And if you have me in class, I like to throw in some other things. Software development is about problem solving. Just did one in my online class last week where they had to post for part of their group project. They had to post something on the discussion board, and only one person in the group had to post to tell the rest of the class about it. But everybody in the class had to do replies. Thing was that unless they made the initial post, they couldn't see other people's replies. And I set it up that way because, well, they're software development majors. They need to practice problem solving. It's like, here's a problem, figure out a solution. I was really happy. Less than half the class sent emails about it. And most of the ones that sent emails had a suggestion on what they could do. They just wanted to make sure it was okay. It's like, yep, that's exactly why I did that. This field's about problem solving. So if you like solving problems and creative stuff, what I really like about software development is the creative aspect, the artwork. Even doing some, what would be the most boring subject? Creating accounting software, right? That just sounds boring, doesn't it? Accounting software, it's useful, it's an important thing to have, but it sounds boring. It sounds boring to begin with. I get the same feeling when I see that working as I do when I pick up the guitar and write a song, or pull out the paints and paint a picture. Open up Word and write a poem. That creative aspect, the artistic flow, I really feel like programming is an art thing, and that's what I enjoy the most about it. So if you're an artistic, creative person, programming is a great field to get into because that's basically what you do. Create artistically useful things that people will pay lots and lots of money for. So that's a quick pass at PowerShell. There's a great place to learn it built in. So if you're on a Windows machine, on Linux, you might have to install this. If you search, instead of going right to the terminal, if you start searching for PowerShell, whoops, what did I just start? I just started. If you start searching for PowerShell or type the whole thing out, you should see PowerShell ISE. That's integrated shell environment. So any of the integrated environments are the software built for for writing software. So integrated shell environment, this has a lot of extra little tools that are extra helpful to learn. But for one, you'll notice there's the PowerShell, so terminal, so we can type things in right here. Still have our terminal emulator. There's also a text editor up here, so we could write all of our stuff in a text file and save it there. So if I really wanted to keep that function, the up arrow, you can use the up arrow in the terminal, that's consistent. So I can go over here and copy this whole function, copy that, and paste it in here. Oh, it copied all those arrows, that's a problem. So I need to get rid of those. White space does not matter in PowerShell beyond that things are space delimited, which is the fancy word for spread out. So any white space you add in there is just to make it readable. And writing it all over at the left is kind of hard to read, right? It's not bad. If I come up here and start indenting things, well, I'll do it all at once. Oops, what did I do? Over here. So I'll select everything but that outer set of curly braces and indent once. And then everything that's inside of curly braces, I'll indent that again. See how it's a little bit easier to read now? And we can add in comments. So like adding a pound sign gives us that comment thing, just like we saw a moment ago with Python very quickly. The text that will be ignored, once we hit a pound sign in a line, the rest of that line will just be ignored. So like this curly brace is end of if block. It's easy to get lost in curly braces, especially as software gets big. So it can be really useful to label those closing curly braces with a comment. Another useful thing for comments. Also, comments are text in this text file that our interpreter will ignore. So there's absolutely nothing, at least theoretically, that stops us from ignoring the PowerShell code and only reading the comments. So a common thing is to put website generators in the comments. And then basically we have two things going on in one text file. Those are the only comments I ever use, the ones that just automatically generate web pages. But here I can save this function and then run it over and over again. So if I save that, I go to document, I go to my working spot, and yeah, untitled.ps1 sounds like a good name. And if I hit the run button, notice it runs down here. We don't have any output, but I can ask for that function over and over again. Do stuff with 2 and 12. And we get all those inputs and outputs. So a place to write our code and then run it, but a little bit more. So you'll notice over on the right-hand side, there's a list, and this list has all of the functions in PowerShell. So you can just choose from this. I think you can install this on Linux still, but, and you can grab all of them. So like get event, I'll click on that. And notice when I click on it, it gives us a GUI to type into. So I go back to the full list. Oh, new item. That was one we looked at. I'll use the search bar. So look for new item and get it on there. When I click on that, it gives us a GUI to type into. So that we don't have to type the commands there and we can see what it is. And there's also a nice little help button. Everybody knows what the help icon looks like, right? When we click this, a little dialog box pops up with that thing we'd get if we type get help in there. So this integrated shell environment is PowerShell telling you how to use PowerShell. That's a great thing to learn. Right? You're not going to learn it in one sitting. I don't really expect you to remember much of that. Hopefully you remember how to change directories and make new items. So this one right here, change directory, new item, remove item. Start with that. And on your way through school, just learn a little bit because you can see it's a really, really long list. Does everybody understand how to read those instructions like we talked about earlier? Just one quick recap. If the type, if it's parameter, and then the type is after the square bracket, the square brackets, then it's required. If the type is inside of the square brackets, it's optional. And if there's just square brackets and it doesn't show a type, then it's a Boolean. So write it to make it true and leave it off to make it false. And then this will show you, this thing here is PowerShell showing you how to use PowerShell. Just let it add up slowly on your way through school, right? If you learn three of the PowerShell functions per month, you'll know quite a bit by the time you graduate. More than enough that you will be happy to put PowerShell on your resume and could show off your PowerShell skills at an interview if you do 3 a month for the next 2 years. That's a lot of features, and that's definitely not overwhelming. You might find if you like computers, you'd probably learn a lot more than that. But PowerShell ISE is definitely the way to learn. You definitely have it on your Windows machine. If there's not a way to install it on Linux, I've never tried it on Linux. And it is a full programming language. I'm gonna go ahead and close out the terminal. This little app on my desktop, is it open? I think it's closed. This little application, this has been building up over several computers. After somebody broke in and stole several computers, I started migrating to things on the internet and cloud stuff. But the shortcuts are harder to get to, right? We have to open a browser, type in an address, and do all that. So I started putting those here. And this button right here opens the source code for this thing. Like sometimes the main contents of browser, sometimes a document editor, sometimes right now it's a simple text editor with a checklist. It's going through changes. The shortcuts on the buttons change. So a dynamic thing, but it is written in PowerShell. So we scroll down here. There's a PowerShell function. We just saw that syntax, right? Keyword function, give it a name, some stuff in parentheses, and then I guess new object kind of looks like the stuff we were looking at earlier, and then the dollar sign to indicate those are variables. And then most of the functions are like this. Like the open chase function, just put some stuff in the status bar, that little thing at the bottom of the screen tells us what we're doing. And then it starts Chrome with the address for chase.com. So just abbreviated that. So the PowerShell commands and built this little piece of software that I pretty much always keep open on my computer and use over and over and over again. I've been keeping it around through several pieces of software. So it's not a small thing that you can only make folders and do other stuff. It is full control of your operating system. That's how I generically refer to all of them. PowerShell, the old Windows command prompt, Bash, Zsh, Fish. There's a huge list. Way too long of a list. I could stand here until we run out of time tonight and list them all, and not off the top of my head. I could Google the list and then read that list, and we're out of time and not even probably barely get halfway through it. There's lots of them, but some are much more popular than others. In PowerShell, Linux and Mac were working on modern scripting languages at the same time Microsoft was. And when Microsoft released PowerShell, they just scrapped their plans and went with compatibility instead. So they're like, okay, we're not even going to come close to what Microsoft did with this. So we're just going to go with compatible with Microsoft. It's one of those times where Microsoft did something great. Usually their names can be a bit annoying, right? We sigh when we hear Microsoft. But whenever Microsoft, the stuff they do well, it's really easy to remember why they have their place in the computer industry. It's like, oh yeah, that's why they're at the top. It's been a long time since they did anything good. I forgot about it. There are reasons for it. PowerShell is one of the great ones. They all have the same thing, and I generically refer to them as operating system control languages. That's what they are. Every button that we click with our mouse, the way you're used to using a computer on your phone, with everything you tap on, it's actually running one of those instructions in the background. If you're on an Android or an iPhone, so pretty much every phone in existence, it's running a bash command in the background. No matter where you click, it runs a bash command. So, but for some reason, they won't let us type the bash commands in directly. Well, there's a good reason for it, but not for an introduction class. And if you have the SDev 264 class with me, or maybe I'll teach the Swift class at some point, and same thing applies for iPhones, but there's a good reason for it, but not for a class that has an introduction in the name. It's a very complicated reason, takes a minute to get into, but and has a lot of background. I thought that would be useful, and actually doing something instead of just notes and definitions on the board. There's enough of those, right? Hopefully you will find that useful. I would highly recommend getting some practice with that. This video is recorded. You can refer back to it. Usually takes about 15 minutes, about 15 minutes after class. If you don't know where those are, on our Ivy Learn shell. Well, for long-term storage, I keep things on YouTube. So as long as you've clicked this playlist from somewhere that I get, one of my playlists from somewhere that I've given you, you have access to all my videos like the public, private and public videos. So the video will be there, but I don't usually get around to that weekend. But within 15 minutes or so on this link that says Zoom, if you click that, there's a tab for cloud recordings. So you can refer back to that stuff tonight and give some of that a try. Or you all know the process, right? How do I create a new file in PowerShell? We just go Google those words, and we will be bombarded with more tutorials than we could ever read through in a split second. Another thing to look for on your way through school is find some good tutorial sites. Always look at official documentation first. I'll say that, but official documentation is hard to read. Tutorials only have the beginning step. Official documentation is the user manual. So look at the official documentation first. It's probably not going to make a lick of sense the first couple times you see it. Then step over, then look up a tutorial that's nice, simple first steps. And instead of using the tutorials to learn that one step, use the tutorial, then go back to the user manual. Use the tutorials to learn how to read the user manual. So then you know how to do everything in there. Because that whole user manual would have been written by the same person. So once you see how their style goes, right? It's like, what are they talking about? Go look it up on a nice tutorial. Tutorials point's a pretty good one, right at the top here. Find some of those sites you like and use that. And then go back to the documentation and be like, oh, that's what they were talking about. And then you learn how to read the entire user manual and you know exactly how to do everything there, not just the one single step. So make sure you're using tutorials correctly. You all know that. I highly recommend taking what we talked about in PowerShell further. Does anybody have any questions about that? I see your head shaking no. Well, if you have any questions, let me know. So my plan was shuffled around from what I mentioned when I said I was going to cancel class next week when I'm in Indianapolis. Any thoughts on that? Anybody definitively want me to have class, or y'all be okay if I cancel class next Thursday? Okay, we'll talk about networks on Tuesday, so we'll probably go till about 8:30 to try to get a bunch of stuff in. It could be quicker. I usually practice lectures first, so I will see how much I can consolidate it. I have 3 sets of notes, and when I put them together, I thought it was important. I at least want to go through the terminology and the pictures. I at least want to get through 2 of those. We'll see how far we can get on Tuesday, talk about networks. But this is an introduction class, and every one of y'all is required to take a networking class later. So it's not like we're in the advanced networking class and this is going to be the last time you see it. You'll see it again. So we're previewing it, surveying it. Remember that from this class. We're surveying all the different fields make sure you're in the field that really catches your interest. Because the lowest paying field in IT still pays really well. And happiness is worth a lot. So if you're doing what you love, the money is just an extra little bonus. Wake up, right? I know what you're heading towards. If you're sitting there making game development because you love making video games, the really good paycheck that comes with that is just a bonus. You're going to wake up and excited every morning to make video games, not to get a big paycheck. When you wake up every morning for the paycheck, most people that do that end up miserable. And most of us in IT are here because we like machines. We know about this because we really like the machines. If y'all have any questions, let me know. I'm always happy to help. I teach more than just this class, so I can answer lots of questions. If you have any questions learning IT, I'm here to help you get a good foundation built for your IT studies. Let me know. Otherwise, y'all have a great weekend. I will see you on Tuesday and we'll cover networks.